Well, it's been another tough week here in Minnesota. Many of our immigrant neighbors are still locked away in hiding. There are still stories of ICE agents waiting at bus stops and videos of abandoned vehicles with windshields smashed in where people were dragged away without due process. Even people who do get released are often dropped off in the cold outside the Whipple building without a coat or a ride home. Many people are scared and unsure of what the future holds, and many others are sad and wondering what they can do. They're questioning, am I doing enough? And truly, though, I think this is a good time to come together and to be the church. Because when you follow the life and the story of Jesus closely, you realize that every week, Jesus shows up and teaches us something about loving our neighbors and being with those who are in need. And one of those radical things that Jesus does, this radical idea that's at the center of what we're about as Christians, one of those radical things is actually something very simple. It's this, that Jesus comes close to us. Jesus comes like really close to people, which is the story of Epiphany as a whole, right? God comes down to the world in the form of this very vulnerable, fleshy child who shortly after he's born has to flee his homeland for fear of Herod, and he becomes a refugee in Egypt. Right? Jesus joins us where we are. And that may not sound too radical to you, but kings do not often come down from their thrones, and certainly not at great risk to themselves. But that's what Jesus does. All right, last week we heard a story about Jesus calling the first disciples and how there was something so compelling about this Jesus, something so compelling about this person that they dropped their nets, they dropped everything and followed him. But do you know the very next thing that Jesus does? It comes right between that story and the story that we read today. It's not in our lectionary text, but I'll summarize it for you quickly. It says in Matthew 4:23 that Jesus went to the temples and he gave good news to the people. And he spent time healing people with all kinds of mental and physical illness, even paralysis. And because of this work, it says that great crowds started to come from all over, all the different parts of the countryside, and they started to come and they surrounded Jesus in these crowds. And I can't help but think of the closeness of Jesus when I talk about Jesus being in these crowded spaces. And in particular, the people that Jesus gets the closest to are the sick and the dying and the mentally unwell and the suffering and the poor. Jesus gets right up next to these folks, and he puts his hands on them, and he heals them, and he loves them, and he's in relationship with them. I think that gets lost in the conversation sometime about Jesus being on high, but he's amongst them, and he knows their names. And I lift this up today because Jesus often does preach to us from on high. Even in our text today, it says right away, right? The crowds surrounded Jesus, and so he went up to the mountain so that he could share the good news with the disciples, share a lesson with these disciples. These stories that we read today, they're called the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes. Right? Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. And I think it's important for us to remember that these are actually not abstract lessons for Jesus. Right? They're not abstract lessons because Jesus was a refugee who did struggle in this world and was oppressed. But Jesus took these life experiences and he used them to show empathy and compassion for his neighbors. Jesus healed Janet, who's been struggling with mental health issues. Jesus put his hands on Jose, who had a skin condition. Jesus cured Tamika, who could barely walk. Right, these people had names, and he knew their names. Jesus was up close with people who were hurting, and out of that came these sayings, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Right? Notice how declarative these statements are. Right? Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They will be comforted. It's not a question. It will happen. But Jesus is certain about these things. And he's not certain about them just because this is like a future far-off thing that God will do. Jesus is certain about these things because he is making them happen in his day-to-day being. These ideas don't come out of a vacuum. Jesus' response to being up close in person with people who are suffering is to name their blessedness. Now, these words come directly from Jesus being with the neighbor. They come out of that lived experience. And I know that sort of blessing, it goes against sort of our sensibilities in a way, not just modern sensibilities, but biblical sensibilities as well, right? All right, in our minds, the poor, they're not blessed. They're poor. You aren't blessed if you're mourning, you're sad. Right? Being bleak isn't blessed. You have to be strong to get the things that you want in this life. At least that's what the world tells us. But Jesus turns that upside down, not just in a spiritual way, but also in a lived experience kind of way, by being present with people, by making blessing happen. Jesus says these people are blessed because I am with them. He's with them. He's actively making this happen in people's lives, turning their real life curses into real life blessings. And Jesus takes this example of this world and he gives these lessons directly to his disciples, those people who follow him. And the implication is that the disciples put these teachings into practice themselves, just like Jesus did, that they be the blessing that Jesus is for the neighbor in need, that they be up close and personal, and that they know people's names, that they bring healing to people who are suffering. Jesus is not telling the disciples that a far-off thing that God will do is bless these people one day. This is a lesson and a pattern for what Jesus would have them do and what Jesus would have you do. Right, getting up close, being present, being in relationship with people who are hurting. You know, these past weeks, thousands and thousands of Minnesotans have shown up in their neighborhoods. I don't know about you, I have felt very proud to be a Minnesotan in many ways these last few weeks. Last week, over 50,000 people showed up in protest in negative 20-degree weather in downtown Minneapolis alone. Again, yesterday, thousands showed up to protest ICE actions in Minnesota. And I've personally heard, and I know you all have as well, countless stories of neighbors showing up for their neighbors, right? That people delivering groceries to people who are in hiding, often meeting those neighbors, sometimes for the first time. Still others are being trained to be constitutional observers, and others are making donations of food and money to those in need. And we're 1,000,000 miles away from this problem being over. Right? Our neighbors are still harassed and taken. But the point still remains that the people showing up here in Minnesota, our congregation, this body, and the wider community around us showing up makes a difference. And it matters how we show up. Jesus asks us to bless those who are suffering the most, and we do that by getting up close to our neighbors, by building meaningful relationships, by loving them directly and not abstractly. Jesus wants us to be the blessing for others. And into the future, perhaps one of the most important things we can do is just to continue to do that, to be in real, meaningful relationships with our immigrant neighbors, folks who are struggling, folks who don't have enough to eat. To be up close and to be the blessing that Jesus asks us to be now and into the future. Because honestly, when I think of that crowd of 50,000 people from a week ago, I think Jesus would be right in the middle of it. I think he'd be right in the middle of it. I think he'd be getting to know people's names. I think he'd be in relationship with as many people as he could. And also, I know that when that protest is over, because everything comes to an end, that I think after that is over, Jesus will still be with those folks who are in need. And that's where his disciples are called to be as well. Let us continue to show up in a holy way for our neighbors, Woodlake, in the teaching and the way of Jesus. Amen.